Mondays. We're happy to see everybody. And we're kicking off the new academic year today. And I think we have a really interesting and diverse calendar for you throughout. My name is Tess Jones. I'm the director of the Arts and Humanities and Healthcare program here at the center. And I have a few announcements, as I always do. First and foremost, David has just informed me that our brand new bookmarks have arrived. And on the back of them, they have the arts and medicine schedule. So you can grab one of those. Very attractive here. And you'll have that schedule. Next week, we're going to welcome Dr. Phyllis Ying from Seattle. She has published an absolutely wonderful book that is both text and drawings on her internship year in a family medicine residency. So she'll be with us next week. And following the 24th, the 24th, and then following that, October 15th, Howie Movshevitz is back, and he's bringing cartoons this year. So you want to be sure to get that on your calendar. I'm going to stop there. So I have the honor and the joy of introducing our presenter today, whom I was told this is his 7th Arts and Medicine presentation. So I would say that he is a perennial favorite for us and a perfect way for us to begin the year. So Dr. Joe Gall grew up in Budapest, Hungary, and is a graduate of the American University, Cairo, Egypt. He earned a PhD in chemistry at the University of California, Davis, and he retired from the faculty of the University of Colorado School of Medicine in 2017. And he retired from the departments of medicine and pathology. He is Professor Emeritus. His scientific interests focus on the history of science and medicine. Dr. Gall's last 2 presentations included chemical warfare, history, science, medicine, and morality, and chirality, which is handedness in science, medicine, art, and architecture. He's presenting today on Out of Thin Air, the triumph and tragedy of Fritz Haber. And so I will turn it over to Dr. Joe Gall in his 8th presentation for Arts and Medicine.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tess, for that kind introduction. And I'm very grateful to the Arts and Humanities in Healthcare program for this additional invitation. I would have thought that you've had enough of me by now, but I'm very grateful for the invitation. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for attending. Now, I'm going to stand here, and some of you may resent looking at my back. In that case, you could move a little bit over if you want, but if you want to stay there, that's fine as well. Let's see if I can figure this thing out. Yeah, as you can see from the title here, or rather, I should explain, my talk today is from a chapter in the history of science with broader implications, as we shall see. And the question immediately arises, why should we care about history? Why should we study history? And a number of illustrious figures have given answers to this question. I selected for today's lecture the answer by George Santayana, who was a Spanish-American philosopher, who said something that many of you actually, I think, know. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I really think it's a very accurate and good answer to this question. Our story begins at the very end of the 19th century, when an eminent British scientist named Sir William Crookes issued a dire warning he said that in the next few decades, there'll be mass starvation on Earth due to lack of food. By that time, the world's population had grown to 1.6 billion. And the problem was, as Sir William explained, is that world food production couldn't keep up with the increasing population. The problem specifically in this regard was, he explained, was that there was insufficient amounts of nitrogen fertilizers for plant growth and therefore food production. Nitrogen is essential for the human body. Nitrogen is part of a great many substances in our bodies, proteins, DNA, peptides, some neurotransmitters, and so on. It's an essential element in the human biology. Well, there's plenty of nitrogen around. The air around us is almost 80% nitrogen, but it is the element nitrogen, just nitrogen alone, not any compound of nitrogen. And as such, as the element, we can't use it. We breathe in the air, we're getting a lot of nitrogen, and we breathe it out. So that's the problem. And what we need is to ingest compounds of nitrogen. That is, compounds in which whose molecules contain nitrogen atoms connected to some other elements, hydrogen, oxygen, etc. So that's why there was a problem. Now, normally we obtain nitrogen compounds from foods, which in turn obtain them in part from fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers that contain nitrogen compounds. Historically, the traditional nitrogen fertilizers used for centuries were animal and human waste. Other sources used as well as guano, which is excrement of seabirds and bats. Chilean saltpeter is sodium nitrate, used for a long time. There are certain bacteria in soil that produce ammonia as well, and so that's another source of nitrogen compounds for plants. But all of these sources, by the end of the 19th century, were becoming inadequate because of the rapid increase in the population of the world. So Sir William Crookes gave us back then the solution. He said it's very simple, quote unquote. Chemists need to develop a method where you take this huge amount of nitrogen that surrounds us, unlimited quantities of nitrogen as the element. Chemists need to take this nitrogen out of the air and convert it to compounds of nitrogen. And this brings us to the main character of our story, a fellow named Fritz Haber. He was born in December 1868. The arrow points to the town where he was born, Breslau, in the country of Prussia, a German-speaking country. Breslau is the southeastern part, Silesia part of what was Prussia. At the time, there was no such country as Germany. Instead, there were a dozen or more German-speaking countries shown in various colors on that map. He was born into a middle-class Jewish family. His father, Siegfried Haber, was a merchant in dyes and pharmaceuticals. His mother, Paula Haber, died soon after giving birth to him from complications of the birth. 3 years or so after he was born, all these German states were unified into a single German country, which was named then the German Empire. He studied chemistry at the university and obtained his doctorate in organic chemistry at the University of Berlin in 1891. Here is a photograph of him from that period. And he was hoping for a university career, an academic career. In 1893, he converted to Christianity and was baptized a Lutheran. Such conversion by young Jewish professionals was not uncommon at the time in Germany, in academia, in the universities, since advancement in university careers was often difficult for Jews due to rampant anti-Semitism around. In 1894, he did receive his first university appointment as instructor at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And he began his research program. He did excellent work in a variety of areas. He was a very hard worker, but his advancement in the academic ladder, the promotions didn't come, or coming very slowly. And he was very frustrated, but he worked very hard and persevered. And here's a photograph, or rather a painting, or some, I'm not even what it is, in 1903 in that period. And in 1906, finally success came. He was named full professor, ordinarius, as they say in German, which means somewhat the equivalent of a tenured professor in our university system. In the early 1900s, he began a project to study what is called nitrogen fixation, which is what Sir William Crookes proposed, taking elemental nitrogen out of the air and converting it to some compound of nitrogen. It's called nitrogen fixation. Haber begins the project attacking this problem. What he decided to try to do is take nitrogen from air and react it with elemental hydrogen, the element hydrogen, to convert the two elements into a compound called ammonia. Ammonia, a molecule, has 1 atom of nitrogen, 3 atoms of hydrogen. This is an extremely challenging undertaking for one simple reason. Nitrogen is extremely unreactive. It is very resistant to engaging in chemical reactions. Several eminent chemists before Haber had tried this and failed. And he failed initially as well. And then in 1908, one of the large German chemical dye and pharmaceutical manufacturers, BASF, I think the name is familiar even today, gave him considerable financial support to work on this project. And 2 years later, in 1910, he succeeded. He found what was expected, extremely harsh chemical conditions were needed to get this reaction to go. Namely, 550 degrees centigrade, which is well over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, at least 200 atmospheres of pressure, which is very high pressure. A catalyst was needed, and he found that the catalyst that worked really well is an expensive metal, osmium. He found the uranium also worked, but not as well. Well, this achievement brought him a great deal of recognition and honors. First of all, he was appointed the head of a new Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Kaiser Wilhelm in German means Emperor William. And these were a series of institutes in Berlin, scientific research institute. They created one for Haber specifically, and they made him head of it. He was also appointed professor of chemistry at the University of Berlin, very prestigious because the University of Berlin was one of the top universities in the world. And he was elected member of the Prussian Academy of Sciences. And then later, he was awarded the 1918 Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his achievement of the fixation of nitrogen. Well, what he had accomplished was develop this method of reacting nitrogen and hydrogen in the laboratory on a small scale. But if humanity was going to be saved from mass starvation, what was needed is scaling up his laboratory method to an industrial scale, commercial scale. That's what obviously needed for worldwide food production. And that is a great challenge. We saw the harsh conditions that the reaction requires, the equipment on an industrial scale for those conditions, 550 degrees, 200 atmospheres of pressure. That kind of industrial equipment was unknown at the time. So it was a tremendous challenge. Osmium, very expensive metal as the catalyst, out of the question as a catalyst on an industrial commercial scale process. Way too expensive, so they needed to find a different catalyst. Well, the company BASF, which had funded Haber's work and which therefore owned the patents of what he had invented, appointed one of their chemists, a guy named Bosch, a very talented chemist, to lead a team to do the scaling up of the laboratory method to an industrial commercial process. And he was a very capable chemist. He had some engineering training as well, which was needed obviously for an industrial project. And he had some very good people working in his team. And there he is. And they worked out the challenges relatively quickly. Now, by 1913, the first plant producing ammonia by the Haber, now Haber-Bosch process opened in 1913. Bosch was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this and other industrial chemistry discoveries and inventions that he introduced. 2 years later, an additional great step forward was made because the ammonia produced by the Haber-Bosch process was now, a method was developed for its conversion to nitric acid on an industrial scale. And this is very important because some of the nitrogen fertilizers needed are actually nitrates. And you need nitric acid to make nitrates. So this was a great advance. Nitric acid allowed this, the production of nitrate fertilizers and some other substances of great significance that we'll see in a minute. So what was the impact of the Haber-Bosch nitrogen fixation method? It obviously allows production of unlimited quantities of nitrogen fertilizers such as ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, urea, etc. Immense benefit for humanity. Today, world's population is well over 7 billion. The experts estimate that without the Haber-Bosch process producing nitrogen fertilizers, world food production could not support on this earth more than 4 billion people. Now, people have children even when they starve. So we can conclude that the Haber-Bosch process saved the lives of millions, if not billions of people. Ammonia production via the Haber-Bosch process is more than 150 million tons a year. There's a book there that, and you'll see occasionally, just a few times, I have some reference like that, a source that I consider very valuable or very good. This book by Smeal on the Haber-Bosch story is really just excellent if you have any interest in that. But there are negative aspects to the Haber-Bosch process. First of all, it requires a great deal of energy. You saw the conditions. That requires a great deal of energy. Also, the result of the Haber-Bosch process, that large amounts of nitrates are introduced into the environment, and that has serious negative environmental implications. There is another negative. Haber-Bosch process provides explosives in unlimited quantities. Why? Because all the traditional explosives are nitrates or nitro compounds. You need nitric acid to make these explosives, and the Haber-Bosch process, ammonia converted to nitric acid, allows the production of unlimited quantities of explosives, traditional explosives. For example, ammonium nitrate is an explosive, and Timothy McVeigh, when he blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City some, I don't know, 20 years ago, used ammonium nitrate. It's also used as a fertilizer. TNT, trinitrotoluene, an explosive. Nitroglycerin is the explosive in dynamite, etc. So the Haber-Bosch process brought unlimited quantities of explosives to humanity. Obviously, the military use of explosives results in death and destruction on a large scale. But there are beneficial uses of explosives, civilian uses, construction of tunnels, roads, mines, etc. Overall, I would say that despite the negatives, the Haber-Bosch process is essential for human survival and existence. And this brings us to the first few days of August 1914, outbreak of World War I. Now, at the time of the beginning of World War I in August 1914, German nitrates needed for the production of explosives for the war were very limited. It was estimated that the nitrate stocks Germany had was not even sufficient for 1 year of war. Perhaps maximum, if you were an optimist, a year, but most experts said 6 months maybe. But it all changed with the Haber-Bosch process and the conversion of the ammonia to nitric acid, which was accomplished in 1915, just as the war was beginning. This allowed Germany to produce as much in the way of explosive as they needed for the war, and indeed the war lasted well over 4 years. During the first month of the war, the German army had spectacular successes. They very quickly overran and occupied Belgium. They even threatened Paris. But everything changed in the second week of September 1914, when the first Battle of the Marne in France occurred. In this battle, the apparently unstoppable German army was stopped by French and British troops. The war got bogged down, a stalemate developed, and on both sides the armies dug in, and the infamous trench warfare began. Well, we've heard a great deal about the trench warfare. I won't dwell too long on it. Trench warfare. The trenches were a series of horrors for the troops. We are in Northern Europe here mostly. There is rain frequently, so mud and water in the trenches, insects, rats, lack of sanitation, and the resulting diseases like the infamous trench foot. Here is the image of a British soldier in World War I in the trenches, almost knee-deep in water in the trench. German soldiers picking lice from their clothing in the trenches. And then there was the horror of the orders to go over the top. That meant orders to climb out of the trenches and march towards the enemy lines. Usually the enemy lines were fairly close. And what that meant is that the soldiers were forced to march towards the enemy, and the enemy had set up their machine guns. And these soldiers were forced to march into machine gun fire. And this was mass murder. Of the 10 million or so soldiers killed in World War I, a very large proportion of them died in this way, marching into enemy machine gun fires, because the officers, that was the way the war was fought. You just go. So that was trench warfare. Well, in Germany, this situation, the stalemate, the trench warfare, prompted the idea of introducing chemical warfare. Chemical warfare is the use of toxic substances, chemical weapons, to poison or asphyxiate the enemy in combat. At the time, these chemical weapons, these chemical substances used as the poisons were referred to as the poison gas, even though many of these substances were not gases, they were liquids. But some of them were gases. The idea was that the poison gas would drive the enemy troops out of the trenches to the surface, where they can be more readily attacked, because they were no longer hiding then in the trenches. And Haber and other chemists in Germany proposed the idea of chemical warfare. Haber himself thought that the best thing to start with in this regard was chlorine gas. And he recommended that to the German army. Chlorine is a very toxic substance. It causes severe respiratory effects, pulmonary edema, and can be fatal. And sure enough, the German army accepted his idea, and on April 22nd, 1915, the German army began chemical warfare in World War I by releasing about 167 tons of chlorine gas from 5,700 cylinders near a town called Ypres in northwestern Belgium. This is sort of what it looked like, the chlorine pouring out of the cylinders. Thousands of Allied troops were poisoned in this way in this first attack at Ypres. It is estimated that somewhere around 1,000 to 1,400 Allied troops died as a result of the chlorine poisoning. Haber was present at Ypres and directed the deployment of the chemical attack himself personally. Well, predictably, the Allies responded with their own chemical warfare. The British were first in September 1915. This photograph shows British troops marching through their own chlorine that they had released to the Germans, but the wind blew it back, and so the British troops were forced to walk through their own chlorine gas. Roughly, I'm still looking at it because there is no good information, but roughly 55 to 60 chemical weapons, 55 to 60 substances used as poisons in the war. The big three that we hear a lot about is chlorine, phosgene, and mustard gas. But as I said, there's another 55 or so, including some cyanides, a number of arsenic compounds, and many others. Altogether, it's estimated that chemical weapon substances used in the war amounted to 125,000 tons. And there were 66 million chemical weapons, artillery projectiles fired during the war. And you can do the math about how many projectiles of poisons a day were used in the war. It's pretty shocking. And chemical warfare continued until the very end, practically until the last day of the war. Now, during the war, many testimonials by soldiers, nurses, physicians were recorded on the physical horrors and the psychological terror of the chemical weapons. There are many photographs that we have from soldiers injured by these various poisons. These people were affected by mustard gas. Soldiers in World War I, when asked, near universally stated that if they had to die in the war, they would prefer a shell or a bullet anytime over being poisoned to death and its horrors. Mustard gas was the worst of the chemical weapons of World War I. It wasn't a new compound. It had been known for quite a while before the war, but it was adapted to war in Haber's institute. It causes severe chemical burns on the skin and other locations, respiratory damage, that is, blindness, suffocation, cancer, and death. Here is an image of a British soldier. The quality of the photograph is not very good, but you can see that basically his skin is destroyed by the mustard gas. Mustard gas was first used in the war by the German army again, and again at that same Belgian town of Ypres in July 1917. It ended up being used by both sides in the war, and it killed, it's estimated that it killed 35,000 troops, mustard gas alone. Here is a description of what it was like. With mustard gas, the effects did not become apparent for up to 12 hours. But then it began to rot the body within and without. The skin blistered, the eyes became extremely painful, and nausea and vomiting began. Worse, the gas attacked the bronchial tubes, stripping off the mucous membrane. The pain was almost beyond endurance, and most cases had to be strapped to their beds. Death took up to 4 or 5 weeks. Absolute horror. While Haber was fanatically patriotic, nationalistic, and fervently militaristic, and he led the German chemical warfare development, he converted his research institute, the Chemical Research Institute, to a center for the chemical warfare program. But he was also often at the front directing the deployment of the chemical weapons. During the war, he was promoted to captain in the German army for everything he was doing for them. Now, this was a controversial thing because the centuries-old tradition in the German army, a Prussian army, was that Jews could not serve as officers in the army except in the medical corps. Well, the Emperor Wilhelm II forced the army to promote Haber to captain, and there was a tremendous amount of grumbling and anger among the German officers that this had to be done. Haber is often called the father of chemical warfare, and I should mention here, because it'll be relevant later, during the war, beginning in 1917, he also started a program in his institute to develop pesticides. They were needed in a variety of applications in the army, first of all, and the trenches, there were pests all over, but it was also needed, pesticides were also needed in civilian applications. As far as chemical warfare was concerned, Haber expressed himself. He insisted that chemical warfare will be decisive, it'll shorten the war, and it'll bring victory to Germany. He said that it was the patriotic duty of scientists to participate in chemical warfare development. Falsely, lying, he maintained that it wasn't Germany that first used chemical weapons, but it was the Allies. It was a straight lie, entirely untrue. He also said that death by poison is the same as death by explosive. What's the difference? And ignored there the statements, uniform statements of the troops on the front about the horrors of chemical warfare. Overall, he showed little sympathy for the suffering and death of the victims of his poison gases. One obvious question that comes up right away in this regard is, was chemical warfare legal in 1914? And the answer is no. There were two international treaties in force at the time, the two Hague treaties. The second one of 1907 very clearly prohibited chemical warfare altogether. Here it is, Chapter 1, Article 23. In addition to the prohibitions provided by special conventions, it is especially forbidden, A, to employ poison or poisoned weapons. Well, you don't need to be a lawyer to interpret that. Chemical warfare is forbidden. Nevertheless, well, before I go there, at the beginning of the war, all but one of the European belligerents were signatories to the Hague treaties. The exception was Italy, but they joined very quickly as well. During the war, the German government, the military, and the scientists, including Haber, falsely denied that the Hague Treaty prohibited chemical warfare. A little bit about Haber's private life. He married a woman named Clara Immerwahr. Here she is. She was born in 1870. She too into a Jewish family. She too converted to Christianity. And in 1900, as best as I can determine, she was probably the first woman in Germany to earn a PhD in chemistry. Everyone agrees that she was one of the first, but it seems to me that she was the first. In any case, she was one of the first two or three earning a PhD in chemistry in Germany. She married Haber in 1901. They had a son named Hermann the following year. She helped Fritz, her husband Fritz, in his work. For example, Fritz didn't speak English, but he needed English articles, books for his work, and she translated all that for him. She was dedicated to science. She was a PhD scientist. She had aspirations for a career as a scientist. But Haber was entirely unsupportive of her desire for a career as a scientist. In addition, he was oppressive in the marriage. And on May 2nd, 1915, which was 10 days after the first Ypres attack with chlorine gas, Clara committed suicide. The reasons, well, it's difficult, complicated. The literature is conflicted on it. We do know some things. We know, we have documents to this effect, that she was deeply distressed in the marriage. She was also opposed to chemical warfare, and she was very distressed about not being able to have a career as a scientist. But it's complicated. There is also family history of depression and suicide. Hermann, son of Fritz and Clara, committed suicide in 1946. Hermann and his wife had 3 daughters. The eldest, Claire, committed suicide. So there's this matter of likely genetic element, depression, and suicide. Haber didn't sympathize with Clara, didn't seem to understand her needs, desires. This is what he wrote in the dedication or acknowledgement of one of his books. To my dear wife, Clara Haber, PhD, in gratitude for her silent cooperation. That was his understanding. 2 years after Clara died, Haber married again. He married a woman named Charlotte Nathan, an intelligent individual, but without any interest or training in science. Here they are in 1916. This is the photograph after the wedding ceremony outside the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, the most prestigious church in Berlin at the time, in October 1917. Haber loved wearing military uniforms, as you can see there. There is Charlotte, and the young man on the left is Hermann, the son from the first marriage. There were 2 children from the second marriage. Ava, born in 1918, she just died 3 years ago. And in 2010, I was lucky enough to have a long conversation with her by phone. Very, very interesting. The other child in this marriage was Ludwig, a son. They all grew up in England because they had to flee Nazi Germany. Ludwig became, nicknamed Lutz. Lutz became an economic historian, and about 20 years ago, he published this book. It's the best volume on the history of chemical warfare in World War I. Charlotte and Fritz divorced in 1927. And we arrive at the end of World War I, November 11th, 1918, the Armistice. Today is September 10th. So 2 months from now exactly will be the centenary to the day of the end of World War I. About 10 million troops were killed in the war, as I mentioned. Deaths of civilians due to war-related causes are estimated between 7 and 13 million. Despite Haber's predictions, chemical warfare was not decisive, did not produce victory, did not end the war, and the slaughter continued. It's estimated that there were about 1.3 million victims of chemical warfare in World War I. Out of these, about 91,000 died, and often a painful and protracted death. The rest, a great many, were condemned to long-term suffering from the poisoning, respiratory ailments, cancer, cardiac disease, blindness. Mustard gas blinds people. After World War I, the Allies declared Haber a war criminal because of his poison gas work. And so he had to flee Germany and went to Switzerland. But the crisis passed, the Allies relented, and he was able to return to Germany. In the 1920s, he resumed work on chemical warfare secretly. And it had to be secret because the Versailles Treaty, which settled the war, strictly forbade Germany from any chemical warfare-related work. And yet he and other scientists secretly resumed the chemical warfare work. His relentless work schedule, he worked extremely hard. That damaged his health. He was, in addition, a heavy smoker. Many of the photographs that we have of him show him smoking or holding a cigar or cigarette. Perhaps not surprisingly, he developed coronary artery disease. He suffered from insomnia most of his adult life. And so by the early 1930s, he was in very poor health. And speaking of the early 1930s, we need to speak about Nazi Germany. World War I and Germany's defeat in World War I caused immense problems for the country, severe economic, social, and political crises throughout much of the 1920s. And then in 1929, the Depression set in, further aggravating the situation. And many historians are convinced that these crises played a major role in the Nazis' rise to power in Germany. Political, economic primarily, actually. The middle class, the working class were in despair and were tired of the traditional political system, the traditional parties, and they said, we need something else to save us. And that something else was the Nazis. And that's to me seems reasonable. And that kind of process occurs in some other countries as well. It's worth mentioning that the largest chemical company in Germany, IG Farben, was a chemical dye and pharmaceutical manufacturer, was the largest corporate donor to the Nazi Party election campaign in 1932, which brought them eventually to power. Once they were in power, they immediately began the persecution of those they considered undesirable, the non-Aryans. This is a code word for Jews. The Roma, that is the Gypsies, their political opponents, the physically or intellectually disabled, the homosexuals, etc. Well, when the Nazis did come to power in 1933, Professor Dr. Haber, patriot, war hero, Nobel laureate, Lutheran, overnight became Haber the Jew, the enemy. He was initially allowed to remain as head of his institute, but he was required to immediately fire all the non-Aryan members of his staff, which was roughly 25% of the institute staff. To his credit, he made considerable efforts to find jobs abroad for the staff he had to fire. And then on May 1, 1933, he himself resigned to be effective October 1. In August, he left Germany, and now he was separated from his country, his home, his work, his family, his money. And on January 29th, 1934, he died of congestive heart failure in a hotel room in Basel, Switzerland, at age 65. Now, a little follow-up to his pesticide work that I mentioned that they started during the war in his institute. 10 years after his death, there was a tragic sequel to his pesticide work. One of the pesticides his program developed was called Zyklon B. It was a very effective pesticide and was sold beginning in the early 1920s throughout Europe as a pesticide. The poison in it is hydrogen cyanide. It was produced by a subsidiary of IG Farben. Here is a canister of this Zyklon B. At the bottom you see Degesh. That's the name of the IG Farben subsidiary that produced it. It says gift gas. Gift is in German means poison. So it's poison gas. So the company sold this during World War II to the Nazis, to the SS, to be used in the gas chambers of the Holocaust for the murder of well over 1 million people. So IG Farben and they sold it to them. In a tragic irony, some of Haber's own relatives were murdered in this way. It is important to recognize that the management of IG Farben, the company, the parent company, had full knowledge what the SS was using the Zyklon B they were selling them at great profit, by the way. And you can see this book by Borkin is a superb book on this history. So how do we assess Haber? He was obviously a complex individual, a brilliant scientist, one of the greatest chemists of the 20th century. He excelled in a variety of areas of science. He had a unique ability to combine basic science and applications. He wrote a number of books. Some of them are very important. Some of his inventions and discoveries in science retain his name and are still known today. I have a list there. He had superb organizational ability. He was very ambitious and had, as I mentioned several times, an unlimited energy for work. He was an excellent communicator, inspiring, effective, and popular teacher. He had the wisdom to give freedom to his research associate to do their own thing, develop projects on their own. And here he is in a lab looking at one of his associates. So as a result of these characteristics of Haber, scientists flocked to his lab from many countries in the world. As an individual, he had fine education, broad culture, he was sociable, good conversationalist, he enjoyed theater, and he wrote lighthearted poetry that his friends enjoyed very much. He developed lifelong warm friendships, particularly with fellow scientists, such as this guy here, Richard Willstetter, who was a fellow Nobel laureate chemist. Haber had a complicated relationship with Albert Einstein. Here they are together in 1913. The two men had similar backgrounds, but very different worldviews. Einstein was, throughout most of his adult life, underline most, was a pacifist. He was suspicious of authority, condemned German anti-Semitism, and he renounced his German citizenship as a young man. Haber, on the other hand, as we have seen, was militaristic, nationalistic, deferential to authority, ignored the anti-Semitism all around him, and declared himself a proud German. Yet, despite these differences, they remained close friends to the end when Haber died. Haber at home was tyrannical, as we have seen, oppressed Clara. He also mistreated their son Hermann, another tragic story. And as we have seen also, he seemed completely indifferent to the suffering caused by his poison gases. One thing we cannot blame Haber for, however, is the use of Zyklon B in the Holocaust, in the gas chambers. He died 10 years before that happened. So we want to be careful about that. And I mention that because there are historians who have written in the literature blaming him for the use of Zyklon B in the Holocaust. Toward the end of his life, there were signs of change in Haber. For example, in February 1933, just days literally after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, he wrote to his friend Willstätter, "I am fighting with diminishing strength against my increasing disquiet over the future and the feeling of having made serious mistakes in my life." What mistakes? He didn't explain. Another sign of change in Haber was that his last wish was to be buried with his first wife, Clara. That wish was granted, and they are buried together in a cemetery in Basel, Switzerland. So how do we explain Haber's personality? It's very difficult. There is little information in the way of explaining this psychology. He himself never publicly expressed his innermost thoughts. We can conjecture. He was raised without the love and guidance of his mother. As an adult, he had continuing conflicts with his father. Did these elements play a role in his own mistreatment of others? We don't know. Another question is, what were the roots of his fanatical patriotism and militarism? And here too, we could conjecture, but there is really no solid information. One thing is certain, he had great intellectual intelligence, but it is also clear that he lacked what psychologists call emotional intelligence. Empathizing with your fellow human being, sympathy for their needs and desires and their suffering. He lacked that. He clearly lacked emotional intelligence. So Haber was a grand, flawed, enigmatic, and tragic figure of 20th century science. His story raises difficult questions about ethics and morality, and I have 3 questions that I'll go through very quickly. Should we protest tyranny? Once in power, the Nazis, as we saw, immediately began the persecution of the undesirables. But in 1930s Germany, few people protested. Should we protest injustice and tyranny? This is a difficult question in the face of murderous regimes like Nazi Germany. But importantly here, some did speak out and protest tyranny and injustice in Germany. Some of them survived. Many were murdered by the regime. So this is a very difficult issue. Number 2, will chemical warfare ever end? After World War I, chemical warfare was banned by the Geneva Convention of 1925 and the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1997. Nevertheless, it has continued ever since and often used in civilians. I have a list of them. That's Spain, Italy, Japan, Iraq, etc. And in 1936 in Germany, a whole new class of even deadlier chemical weapons were developed, the nerve agents, sarin, VX, etc. And if you watch the news weekly, we hear about chemical weapons deployed in the Middle East in the conflicts there. So chemical warfare is a tragic legacy of World War I and Haber. Finally, should scientists create or participate in the creation of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear weapons? In World War I, Haber participated. Many other scientists on both sides did. But some scientists during World War I refused on moral grounds to engage in the development of chemical weapons. Here are 2 examples. Hermann Staudinger, the German chemist, refused absolutely. Ernest Rutherford, New Zealand-born British physicist, refused. Both of them are Nobel laureates. So, should scientists participate? Here is an excellent article of Jeff Kovac, a professor of chemistry and an ethicist, and he comes down an excellent article. He comes down squarely saying, no, scientists should not participate. My last slide, next to last slide. Lord Lansdowne was a British aristocrat and politician, and he said this during World War I. Just as this war has been more dreadful than any war in history, so we may be sure would the next war be even more dreadful than this. The prostitution of science for purposes of pure destruction is not likely to stop short. I would add, how prophetic. Can science be moral? Thank you for your attention. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer questions. I'll be glad to answer questions. Yes, sir. Yeah, I can. It's interesting. I talked to Ava. Ava Lewis was her married name. She was living in Bath, England, and I managed to track her down, and the city administration gave me her phone number. Most astounding, you know. And I dialed the number. This was in August 2010, and I dialed the number, and she answered the phone. And I identified myself as a professor at the University of Colorado. And we had a long conversation. First thing I asked her was, what was it like to grow up with Fritz Haber as your father? And she says, I don't know. And I said to her, what do you mean? She said, well, he and my wife, as his wife divorced when I was about 9 years old. And so he was at home theoretically for 9 years, but he was never home. He was either in the lab or traveling around the world. So we never saw him. And she said, she wasn't bitter, just matter of fact. She said, he made sure we had the basics, clothing and food and roof. But beyond that, he didn't seem to care about us much, meaning she and her brother. We talked about, he was, again, very matter of fact, she didn't blast him for chemical warfare, but she said, we know what he did in World War I. And then towards the end of the conversation, she said to me, I was surprised, this was 2010, she was 92 years old. And she said to me, did you say you're from the University of Colorado? And I said, yeah, good memory. That was 40 minutes earlier. And she said, well, I have a grandson who works at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And I got really excited. I said to her, well, give me his name and contact information. I'd love to talk to him. And she said, I'm not going to do that. He's Haber's great-grandson. He doesn't know anything about Haber. He doesn't care, really. Leave him alone. And I understood that sentiment. I was eventually able to track the guy down. He works at Boulder. It took me a while, let me tell you. And actually, I went on the CU Boulder website and searched and searched. I didn't know the name, so I used Lewis. I used, I don't know, I tried every way I could. I couldn't find it. Eventually, 4 years later, 2014, I met and became friends with Haber's great-granddaughter, who is a nurse in Paris, and we became good friends. Isabel is her name, and she gave me the great-grandson's name in Boulder. So I contacted him because in 2014, right here on campus, I gave a lecture, not on Haber, but just on chemical warfare. It was here on campus at in the Ed 2 building, and so I wrote to the great-grandson in Boulder. He's in the administration dealing with IT, and introduced myself and invited him to attend my lecture on chemical warfare because it was inevitably going to include Haber. And he wrote and said he would attend. And then he didn't show up, but there was a big snowstorm that day, so I understood. I invited him to this lecture as well, and he never answered my email. So his grandmother was right. He doesn't care. Yes. Push the button on the microphone.
Did Haber benefit financially from all of that?
Yeah, so you heard the question, did he benefit financially? He benefited considerably from his invention. What happened, however, is that when the Nazis came along and he had to flee Germany, they didn't allow him to take anything. So he didn't have much money once he became a refugee, if you will. So it's sort of a double-edged sword. Yes.
Does the company IG Farben still exist? It sounds familiar. And if they do, did they ever acknowledge and repudiate their sale of Zyklon B for a known purpose?
Interesting and important question. Thank you. IG Farben doesn't exist. At the end of World War II, it was dissolved. It had been created as a full company in 1925 by the merger of 8 large German chemical dye and pharmaceutical manufacturer, BASF, Bayer, AGFA, 8 companies like that, created it, merged to become this giant IG Farben. Farben in German means colors, dyes, showing the origin of these companies. They all started with the invention of mauve, which I gave a lecture here some time ago. But anyway, IG Farben was dissolved after World War I, and the individual companies, many of them, Bayer, BASF, AGFA, were recreated as separate companies. Regarding their acknowledgement of knowingly selling the poison for the gas chambers, they never admitted anything. In 1947, at the Nuremberg trials, which were conducted by countries separately. So the Americans tried 12 or 13 of the top executives of IG Farben. And among the charges in the trial was mass murder. It was one of the accusations, mass murder. This was beginning in spring or early summer 1947. Well, it's complicated, but actually speaking of the ethics of morality of all of this, this is a very sad story, and Borkin's book deals with it. Some of the 12 executives were acquitted. A few of them were sentenced to prison for mass murder. The longest prison term given for a couple of them was 8 years. Most of them had already served several years, so they all came out free and continued their successful careers. And the question is, how can that be that in the Nuremberg trials, these people tried for mass murder are given this sort of light sentences? It's unthinkable. The prosecutor, the American prosecutor, was so angered that he said afterwards that in the United States, a chicken thief would get a longer sentence. And the explanation is, some historians believe, is we are in summer of 1947. The war is over. Our ally, the Soviet Union, is now our enemy. Cold War. It's the Cold War. And the enemy is not Germany. It's the Soviet Union. And we cannot do anything to alienate the Germans. We cannot sentence to death these top German businessmen. Some of them were scientists, actually. And it's this turn in the attitude, the Cold War. We can't hurt Germany. And it was an outrage. The British, when they tried a little earlier, 2 or 3 top executives of another company that produced Zyklon B, sold, didn't produce, another company that was selling it under license from IG Farben. The company was called Testa. They they tried 3 of their top executives and sentenced to death 2 of them for knowingly selling Zyklon B to the Nazis. So the British did much better. Yeah, they were carried out.
Regarding the Manhattan Project.
Wow, that is really complicated. It's difficult, World War II and all its horrors. I've been to Japan, I've talked to people, I've read the history. I don't claim to be an expert. I haven't studied it like I've studied this. So I'm not really the ultimate authority here. My own bias and beliefs based on what I know and what I've read is that the United States wanted to drop the bomb no matter what. It was the idea that we have to show the Russians that we are the boss. We set conditions for Japanese surrender, and I'm not excusing the Japanese. Japanese militarism was horrible. But we set the surrender terms such that they couldn't accept it. We wanted the emperor to resign. I think it was done knowingly, deliberately, that is what I mean. And the purpose was to show the Russians that we have the bomb, we can use it, and they better watch out. That's my view. I know many of you will disagree. That's, as a non-expert, that's my view.
Dr. Gall, we're out of time. If you would be kind enough to stay for a few minutes and talk with people who have other questions. Join me in thanking Dr. Gall for another wonderful presentation.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Tess.